Hello, classic rock fans. Happy holidays. Here we are at the end of another year. And just like last year, I thought it would be fun to put together a little vlog here about some of the books I read in 2021 and also my plan for what books I'm going to try to get to in 2022. I did this last year, and I'm hoping this can sort of become a yearly tradition. Basically, if you're looking for some book recommendations, here's the ones I read. Maybe you'll enjoy them as well. And hey, if there's some books you would recommend to me, please feel free to post them in the comments below. So, what I read in 2021 can be broken up into one of three categories. One, books that I read and then interviewed the authors of for this podcast. Two, books that I read as part of research for episodes of this podcast. And three, books I read just for fun, just for me. So we're going to talk about the ones that I had the authors on as guests on this show first, and very quickly, because I have already had conversations about these books on this channel. You can check out those interviews. I dive deep into each of these books with their actual authors quite a bit in my conversations with them. I really recommend you checking that out because the author interviews I've done this year I'm very proud of, and I think we covered some great topics. And these are all very good books. So let's dive into those first. So the first person I interviewed in 2021 was Joe Milliken, who wrote this book, Let's Go, Benjamin Orr and the Cars. This is a biography of Benjamin Orr from the Cars. Benjamin Orr passed away about 20 years ago, and sadly, his story has sort of got lost in the shuffle in the great overarching history of classic rock. Joe reached out to me earlier this year, introduced me to his book because I was not aware of this book. I got a hold of a copy. I read it over the course of a week. I thought it was great, and I absolutely wanted to have Joe on the show. Real nice guy, and a very fun interview, and a very interesting interview. I gotta say, these are the kind of projects that classic rock fans really need to support, because Ben Orr has been gone, unfortunately, for 20 years at this point, and it's really up to us, the fans, to keep his memory alive. And Joe's definitely went above and beyond doing that. So if you want to learn more about this book, please check out my conversation with author Joe Milliken. That was a really good interview, and I really appreciate that he came on the show. The next interview I did this year was with author Carrie Stevens about her book, Unrated Revelations of a Rock and Roll Centerfold. This book has had a ton of buzz on social media. So getting her to come on this show was a bit of a coup because she's very active in her career. I'm really appreciative that she made time to make an appearance on this show to talk about this book. I really liked this book. I thought it was a real honest look at sort of the underbelly of rock and roll, and as she has had several connections to that world, most famously through her boyfriend Eric Carr, who was in Kiss and passed away tragically young. But Carrie has a fascinating story outside of the entire Kiss world. So I had a lot of fun diving into her story, and I think it's really important for the classic rock community to make sure that we're seeking out women's stories, because it is so easy for just rock and roll to become such a boys' club. So I had a lot of fun talking with Carrie in that interview. I recommend you checking it out. That was my most popular episode of the year. And a snippet from that interview that I posted on YouTube is my most popular video on the channel. So her fans are out there. Kiss fans are out there. People want to know her story. I think you should check out her interview because, like I said, it was a bit of a coup getting her to come on the show. And again, I'm very appreciative for her making time for us because it was a lot of fun talking to her. And I really enjoyed this book. So if you're looking for sort of a look behind the scenes of the world of Kiss, David Lee Roth, and so many other rock and roll connections, there's a lot of fun stuff here. So the last interview I did in 2021 was with Keith Miles about his book, Bob Dylan in London, Troubadour Tales, and then also the book he just put out like a couple of weeks ago, Bob Dylan in the Big Apple, Troubadour Tales in New York City. I read this book and I made my way through most of Bob Dylan in the Big Apple. Both are great reads, and we had a very fun conversation about Bob Dylan's connections to both the cities of London and New York. Keith is a bona fide Dylan historian. He's an expert in Bob Dylan, and we've done a lot of Bob Dylan content on this channel in 2021, so it was very cool to talk to someone from that community and get his perspective on some of the most interesting parts of Bob's career. So if you're someone who wants a Bob Dylan book that isn't, the length of a phone book and isn't going to take months and months out of your year to read, this is a very cool collection of stories of Bob Dylan's connections to London. And if you're more interested in like American New York stories, well, his new book, Bob Dylan and the Big Apple, can have that for you as well. So, Bob Dylan London by Keith Miles. Definitely check out our conversation. It was a real treat having him on too. Another guest I had on the show in 2021 was author Jesse Fink about his new book, Pure Narco, which he wrote with Luis Navia, who also was a guest on the show. This was my most ambitious project of the year, to have two guests on at the same time, and also to talk about a subject that's not specifically about music. Pure Narco is a true crime story, and Luis Navia is the subject of the book. It's about his time as a cocaine smuggler in the 80s and 90s, and it's a look at the real world underworld of drug smuggling. It's a absolutely captivating, exhilarating, super exciting story. This is a page turner. It just grips you from start to finish. This guy goes through some very harrowing experiences, and he gets by the skin of his teeth. And Jesse does a great job of putting that story to page and also giving the broader context of what that world is around this individual story, and also, of course, about his capture and what he's done in the years since, and how he's sort of made a new life for himself. It was a real treat talking to both those guys. This was also a bit of a coup to have these gentlemen on the show. Jesse's a very successful author. I know Jesse because he wrote a book about Bon Scott that I used as the primary resource for my podcast episode about Bon Scott. That's probably the best book about AC/DC ever written. And he wrote a book about AC/DC even before that. So Jesse was definitely someone I wanted to have on the show. I'm hoping he's going to come back in a couple of months to talk about the AC/DC project. But he told me about this book, which came out this year. He asked me if I wanted to have a conversation around that, even though this is, a music show. And I absolutely jumped at the chance because the man is a hell of a great writer, and this story just sounded incredible. And it is. And it was very cool to talk to both of those guys. So if you want to learn more about a true crime story about real-world cocaine smuggling in the 80s and 90s, you could do a hell of a lot worse than this. This is definitely something to check out. And hopefully we'll have Jesse back again soon. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the books I read for research for my other podcast episodes I did this year. I mention them in the podcasts, but I typically just cite them at the end of the episode. I usually don't have time to talk too much about them, so hopefully we can take just a moment here to look at some of the books I've been reading this year for research purposes. Grace Notes by Katie Segal. I did a podcast episode about Katie Segal earlier this year, and that was done because I really loved this book. I love Katie's story, and I just had to do a podcast about it because, she's most famous, for being an actor, but she's had a really interesting music career that should not be overlooked. And I wasn't sure of all of the details before I got this book, but as soon as I read it, I thought, oh yeah, let's get this on the podcast because, she's got some great classic rock connections and she's got some very cool music. in her career, and that shouldn't be forgotten. So I really recommend this book. Katie tells her story in a really accessible, enjoyable way. It's a very thoughtful, very insightful book. This is definitely not a ghost-written celebrity memoir. So for celebrity memoirs, this is a good one. Check out Grace Notes by actor Katie Segal. For my episode about Steppenwolf, I got a reissued copy of Magic Carpet Ride, the autobiography of John Kay and Steppenwolf by my man John Kay. No relation to me. Okay, again, same last name, but we're not related. I love Steppenwolf. I wanted to get my hands on this book last year. They reissued it through the website late last year. Signed copies. You know, I got my signed copy just because I have so much admiration for John in this band. I didn't really have any expectations of what this book was going to be because I haven't seen it in bookstores, at least not that I can remember. I just got to come out and say it. This is one of the best autobiographies I've ever read. It covers everything. He gets statements and quotes from past band members and close friends and other people who were involved in various stories. People who have different perspectives of him. People who are sort of critical of him. You know? Like, it's a really honest look at his life. And this should be on more best ever rock memoirs lists. This was fascinating. This guy has an amazing story. I tweeted a story from the book at David Crosby earlier this year, and he responded about it, so that was sort of fun. If you're looking for a good autobiography from the world of classic rock, I really, really recommend Magic Carpet Ride, the autobiography of John Kay and Steppenwolf. So definitely get the new copies of the book because it was originally published in the 90s, and the new version includes a couple of additional chapters that get you from where the book was initially published caught up to where he's at today. So, highly recommended. Okay, so the biggest project on this show we've had this year is my collaboration with my friend Chris, Dylan Through the Decades. And to dive deep into Bob Dylan's life and career, I really wanted to get this right. I wanted to have the best information available to me. So I relied on three sources. One, and I don't have the physical copy on hand because I lent it to my dad, but Bob Dylan's book, Chronicles, Volume 1. I enjoyed that book, although it's really limited to just 3 sections of his career. But if you want to hear what it was like for him straight from the source, I think it's a must-read. I think Chronicles is a must-read for any Dylan fan. So if you want a really good look into Bob the Man, I would definitely check out Chronicles Volume 1. Now, if you want Bob Dylan the story, you need something a little longer. You need books that look like this, you know? So I have 2 phone book Bob Dylan books right here. This is Down the Highway, The Life of Bob Dylan by Howard Sunez. And this is Behind the Shades Revisited by Clinton Halen. Hundreds and hundreds of pages between these books. And that's because Bob has had a huge life that requires a phone book's worth of pages to get it all together. Both of these books have been incredibly helpful and just fantastic resources for my research for Dylan Through the Decades. If you're a Bob fan and you want a biography, either one of these, Down the Highway by Howard Sunez or Behind the Shades Revisited by Clinton Halen. And then 2 books I've read before but am rereading for my Jefferson Airplane Family Tree project. Got a Revolution, The Turbulent Flight of Jefferson Airplane by Jeff Tamarkin, and Somebody to Love, Grace Slick's memoirs. I've read both of these books in the past, but I've been revisiting them because I did an episode about Jefferson Airplane earlier this year, and my first two episodes of 2022 are going to be about Jefferson Starship and then Starship as part of our Jefferson family tree history. I can tell you, after reading these books in the past, both are fantastic. This is a absolutely stellar history on the Jefferson Airplane. If you're a fan of that band, this is a must-read. And then Grace Slick's autobiography is alright. It's not the best artist memoirs I've ever read, but it's certainly not bad. She's very funny, got some very unique observations. It's a very engaging read. So if you're looking for a more casual, accessible autobiography, I would really recommend this. Okay, finally, a couple of books here that I read just for fun. Books that I didn't use at all for my podcast purposes, and unfortunately it's a very short list. I need to work on making this list for next year a bit longer. Never Look at the Empty Seats by Charlie Daniels. Charlie Daniels passed away last year. I think he's a really interesting figure in country music history. There's a blurb on the back from Dolly Parton that should tell you all you need to know about his importance in that world. I wanted to know more about his story, so I got my hands on his musical memoirs. He's put out a couple of other books, but those are more religion-orientated, so that's not really for me. I would say this is a lot like Grace Slick's memoirs in the sense that it's fairly short. He does not really dive deep into details of various stories. He just kind of shares his memories. So it makes for a light, accessible read. And of course I would recommend it to anybody who wants to learn more about Charlie. This was the first book I read this year. It took me about a week. Real light read. He does get a little political at times, and I'll be honest, that's a bit tedious, but that's not really until the end, and you can kind of skip through that part if that's not what you're looking for. But if you want to know how old school this guy was, where he came from, down south, and how he crawled his way into, country music history, he fought tooth and claw to get where he was. That's an interesting story, and I'm really glad I read it. So, if you like outlaw country, classic country, this guy's story cannot be overlooked. Okay, Judge Dredd, The Complete Case Files, Volume 5. I said in my year-end list last year that I wanted to read more of Judge Dredd because I'm not really a comic book guy except for Judge Dredd. I love Judge Dredd comics. I have a couple of these compendiums. I've read volumes 6 through 9 in the past, because that's what my local library had. But I wanted this one because this is what includes the famous Apocalypse War, which was as exciting as promised. I don't really know how to sell you on this one unless you're already a fan of this character. Any fans of Judge Dredd who read his comics absolutely should get your hands on this at some point. If you're not familiar with Judge Dredd, there was a movie made, Dredd, in 2012 that was just fantastic. That's what got me interested in this character. There was another movie in the 90s with Stallone, but that's not very good. It was the 2012 movie that got me interested in this character, and a couple of years ago I got a couple of the compendiums, read through the comics, absolutely loved the comics, and now I have a couple of these on my shelf. This was the one I chose to read last year. I'll be definitely reading more Judge Dredd this year. So, like I said, I'm not a comic guy, and if you're not a comic guy, but if you like that Dredd movie from 2012, I give these a shot. I really enjoy them. If you like that movie, it captures the vibe of these comics very well. So I think there's something here that you would like. So, yeah, Judge Dredd. What can I say? Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill. Cargill is the co-host of Junk Food Cinema, which is my favorite movie podcast. I've been listening to that show for years. Cargill is a successful screenwriter. I believe he's behind the film Sinister. He co-wrote the movie Doctor Strange. This guy's a bit of a player in Hollywood. And if you listen to the podcast Junk Food Cinema, it becomes very apparent very quickly that this guy knows movies. Better than you, better than me, better than almost anybody. And a guy who knows movies that well, I figured, knew storytelling very well. And he's an accomplished author. He's got a number of books out. So I just went through the books he had out and picked one that sounded the most interesting to me, which was this one, Sea of Rust. And it's great. It was very hard for me to put down. This was a book I would read before bed, and I would end up staying up later than I originally wanted to because I was too captivated by the story here. I got my brother to read it. He never takes me up on book recommendations, but I hassled him enough about it that he checked it out and enjoyed it as well. So, in the same way that I read Lindsay Ellis's book last year, because I'm a fan of the content she creates online, I figured, I should do something like that this year. And as I'm a fan of Cargill and what he does on Junk Food Cinema, I decided I would just check out one of his books, and, lo and behold, I picked out a really good one. This is going to be my go-to sci-fi recommendation for my friends for years. It's weird how it works out. It's a light, accessible read, but at the same time, it really makes you think. It's sort of the best of both worlds. Some good action in this, and a lot of fun sci-fi concepts. So, big time respect to Cargill. The man spins a good yarn. What can I say? So, if you're looking for a fun sci-fi story, whether you're a super sci-fi nerd or someone who's a bit more of a casual reader, I think either types of people would enjoy this one. And that's it. As far as what I read in 2021. So now we're going to talk about the books that I plan on getting to in 2022. For starters, if you go back to the list I put out last year for books I was going to read this year, I skipped a few of them. I did not make it through my whole list, and that's primarily because of the Dylan Through the Decades project and reading the 4 books about Bob Dylan I did not anticipate reading at the end of last year. So those sort of bumped these 4 off the list, and I'm going to try and make up for that in 2022 and read these books probably earlier in the year than later. But I definitely want to get to them because all 4 appear to be very interesting. The first 2 go together hand in hand. I'm with the Band and Take Another Little Piece of My Heart, both by the amazing Miss Pamela Des Barres. Pamela Des Barres, of course, is the world-famous groupie, perhaps the original groupie, if you will, of rock and roll. This is someone who has a absolutely fascinating history in rock and roll. This is someone who continues to be a part of classic rock history even today. She has her own podcast called Miss Pamela's Pajama Party, which I listen to. I enjoy it quite a bit. She's had some fairly interesting guests on. I know Alice Cooper was a guest. I really enjoyed that episode. But the important thing being here is her story. This is the first one, which she originally published in the late 80s, which details her various adventures with bands like Led Zeppelin, Alice Cooper, and Frank Zappa, I believe Waylon Jennings, and her stories being very up close and personal with these rock and roll legends. And then her follow-up, Take Another Little Piece of My Heart, to my understanding, is mostly about her marriage to rock star Michael Des Barres and how that marriage eventually fell apart. There was a documentary I talked about earlier this year that was released called Who Do You Want Me to Be? About Michael Des Barres. Pamela was in the documentary, and at the time I suggested, and I still feel this way, J. Elvis Weinstein, who directed Who Do You Want Me to Be? About Michael Des Barres, his next project should be about Pamela. Pamela's story is every bit as interesting and important in classic rock history that she deserves a proper documentary about her. So I'm going to read these books. I'm definitely going to try and figure out some way to produce a podcast about her. I would love to talk to her about these books, so I'm going to see if I can make that happen. Obviously, no promises. You know, she's in high demand. She's a very high-profile individual and a very accomplished author. So hopefully we can get something going fairly early next year about Pamela Des Barres after I get through both of these books. Van Halen Rising by Greg Renoff. And Greg has another book out about producer Ted Templeman. This is a highly recommended book about Van Halen's early days as backyard party band and their subsequent rise to success. I have a couple other Van Halen biographies, so at some point this year I want to read this one and maybe the other two and see if I can put together some sort of podcast or retrospective about Eddie and the band at some point, especially now given that David Lee Roth has announced that he's planning on retiring after his short Vegas run in January. The Van Halen history might be wrapping up, and if that's the case, it would be a good time to revisit the origins of that incredible history, and I think this is going to be a great place to start. So hopefully I can get to this sooner than later in 2022. The Dirt by all four members of Motley Crue. I decided not to read this book this year because the stadium tour with Def Leppard has been postponed by a year again. Originally, they were supposed to come back in 2020 because of COVID-19. They had to punch it out to 2021, and because of ongoing issues with the pandemic, they decided to postpone yet again to the summer of 2022. I wanted to read this book and watch the Netflix movie The Dirt, which is based upon this book, sort of at the same time that those guys are back out on the road. I don't know if I'm going to see them in concert. They're supposed to come through Milwaukee. I said in a vlog that I did very early in this channel that I'm sort of disgusted that they're back. I'm not actually happy that they're back on the road. I think it's kind of lousy given how loud they were about hanging it up in 2014. But it is what it is. They are back, and it remains to be seen if this stadium tour actually happens or if it's any good, because, you know, the band has still not been playing, but Vince Neil has been doing solo shows, and those have been a disaster. So there's a lot of rumors that Vince Neil might not be up for this stadium tour, and it could be a big train wreck depending on what conditions he's in. If it looks like they are going to be proceeding with the tour this summer, I will be reading this book along that timeline, and after I read the book, see the movie, maybe see them in concert, I'll figure out something to put together given that they're back. Good as time as any, right? So we'll see what happens with Motley Crue in 2022. Okay, so now we can get to some of the books that I've picked out this year to read in the coming months next year. Unrequited Infatuations by Stevie Van Zandt from the E Street Band. I love Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. The 3 times I've seen them in concert have been 3 of the best concerts I've ever been to. I don't know what else to say. This guy is an amazing character in the world of classic rock. He's hugely important to E Street's history. He's had a very fascinating story outside of the E Street Band. He's done solo records. He did that big Sun City protest charity single that raised awareness about apartheid in South Africa. And in later years, he was on The Sopranos in an acting role. So this guy has done it all. He's currently on XM Radio. I saw him in that Who Do You Want Me to Be documentary about Michael DeBar I mentioned just briefly. I think this is going to be a great read, and I can't wait to hear all those great East Street stories. So we're going to check this one out for sure. Rainbow in the Dark, the autobiography of Ronnie James Dio. Ronnie James Dio passed away before this was published, and it was because of the hard work and dedication of his wife, Wendy Dio, that his memoirs finally got published this year. I think she did an amazing service for Ronnie's fans, and I am really looking forward to reading this. If I'm being perfectly honest, I have never dived deep into Ronnie's discography. Obviously, I know some of the greatest hits, and I actually saw him in concert when I was very young, but I don't know his full story. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. Big time props to Wendy Dio for making this project happen. And in appreciation of that, I'm definitely going to read this book this year. I don't know if she's doing press for it. I'll definitely see if I can get her to come on the show to talk about it, but I think that's going to be a bit of a long shot. But in any case, Rainbow in the Dark, about Ronnie James Dio. AC/DC, The Kerrang Files. This one might be a little out of left field. This is a fairly old book that was published, I believe, back in the 90s? Yeah, originally published in 1995. I got a hold of this book because it is the definitive history edited by Malcolm Dome. And Malcolm Dome passed away this year. And that guy was one of the best rock and roll journalists ever. He's a guy that rock and roll fans should absolutely be familiar with. I cited him as a source during my podcast episode about Bon Scott. Jesse Fink cited him in his books about Bon. So in memory and in respect for that guy's life work, I want to read some of that work. And he wrote some of the articles that are in here, and he compiled this history of AC/DC from the original articles that ran in Kerrang. This looks awesome. I love AC/DC. They're one of my favorite bands, so I think this is going to be a fun read. And, and in doing so, I'm going to be saluting Malcolm Dome for all that great work he did in the world of rock and roll. So, another individual who passed away recently is an author named Mike McPadden, nicknamed McBeardo. I learned about Mike McPadden from Austin Trunick, who I had as a guest on this show in 2020 when we talked about his book, The Canon Film Guide. Austin recommended this book, Teen Movie Hell, by Mike McPadden, and he said it was an excellent resource that inspired him quite a bit during the writing of the Canon Film Guide. And after I talked to Austin about this book on the podcast, I looked it up. I sent it to my family as a Christmas idea, when they were asking me for Christmas ideas, and my dad got it for me as an early Christmas gift last year. And I got a hold of the book. I started paging through it. It looked awesome. And I went on Twitter, and I just posted that, hey, I got this book, and I can't wait to read it. And I tagged Mike in my status. And he retweeted me, said he was honored. And that was awesome. And it made me think, okay, this guy's active on social media. Maybe, once I get through this book, I could have a conversation with him. And when doing some research about him, I came across this book that he wrote called Heavy Metal Movies. And my God, what a title. This is exactly the sort of project that I'm trying to facilitate conversations about here on this show. Like these kind of things, this is why I do the podcast. It's an amazing compendium of movies that have connections to heavy metal music. And look how thick this is. I mean, look at how much work this guy put into it. It's insane. So when I saw this title, I thought, oh, okay, I definitely got to get this book, and I got to see if maybe once I get through it, he'd be interested in coming on the show. Well, lo and behold, out of nowhere, like less than a week after he responded to me on Twitter, I see that he passed away. Totally unexpectedly. And I was absolutely dumbstruck and crestfallen because this guy seemed so interesting, And he seemed like such an unbelievable expert on films, particularly exploitation movies, which is a genre I really enjoy. This guy seemed really cool. And in the weeks and months following his passing, I tried to learn more about him. I found some of the podcasts that he was a part of. He did multiple podcasts. The one I listened to a bit was 70 Films We Saw in the 70s. And sure enough, listening through some of those episodes, this guy was hilarious. And not just knowledgeable, I mean, dude was funny. So yeah, his passing is a horrible loss for the film fan community. There's been a massive outpouring of support and love for this guy, and I'm just hoping I can throw in with that because, you know, obviously I didn't know him. I haven't gotten to these books yet, but just paging through some of this and seeing the amount of work that he did, not just in research, but also in presentation and humor. Austin has posted on his Twitter account about what an inspiration Mike was to him and how supportive Mike was about the Canon Film Guide project. So this guy was just an all-around great dude, and, you know, in honor of his memory, I don't know that I'm going to read both of these all the way through because they are insanely thick. What I want to do is read through parts of each of them and then watch the movies he's actually talking about. So I am going to be using both of these books as a resource for recommendations of movies that I know I'm not aware of but want to be aware of. I know those movies are somewhere in these pages. So I'm going to rely on this guy's work to find more movies to watch. And I don't know what it's going to be, but at some point I am going to do some sort of project based around this book. Even though I haven't read either of these all the way through, I think I can safely recommend these to movie fans, as this was a guy who knew his stuff, loved said stuff, and was very funny about it. So if you're looking for some books about movies, teen movie hell, and heavy metal movies by Mike McBeardo McPadden, definitely check those out. You know, if you knew anything about Mike, please post something in the comments below, because the more I learn about him, the more awesome I think he is. Okay, and finally, I mentioned earlier that I read the book Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill, as he is a content creator I really like and support and was curious about. Last year, for the same reason, I read a book by Lindsay Ellis, because I am a fan of her work on YouTube, and I wanted to see what her creative side, as far as fiction goes, was like with her debut novel, Axiom's End. I enjoyed that book quite a bit. So this year, the online content creator I am choosing to read a fiction piece from is Lindsay Ellis again. This is the second book in her series. This is called The Truth of the Divine. I'm not sure when I will get to this book, but it will definitely be some point this year. Part of the reason I got this book was Lindsay went through hell this year. There was a big attempt to cancel her over the most bizarre thing. I don't understand where all of that hatred that was coming for her originated from. And in a show of support, I figured I'd pre-order this sucker. I'm going to read it. I'm going to post something good about her books because she is a hell of a good writer. I really enjoyed Axiom's End, and I'm sure this is going to be an interesting read as well. I'm going to continue with this series as long as I enjoy it, and we'll dive into this at some point in 2022. And then real quickly, just a couple of books that I don't have physical copies of yet. In fact, 2 of them aren't even out just yet, but they will be at some point in 2022, and I definitely want to get my hands on them. First, Canon Film Guide Volume 2 by Austin Trunick. I talked to him in 2020 about Canon Film Guide Volume 1. Great book. Really fun interview. Super nice guy. Can't wait to talk to him again. I really hope he'll come back on the show. I'm not sure when Canon Film Guide Volume 2 is due out, but I imagine sooner than later because he posted some progress updates through the year, and it seemed that he was getting very close to being done within the last couple of months. So I expect we'll get some news about that soon, and as soon as I can pre-order it, I will be doing just that. Secondly, Living on a Thin Line by Dave Davies from the Kinks. I love the Kinks, in particular Dave Davies. I've seen Ray and Dave in concert solo. In fact, I've seen Dave Davies twice. Great show. Super funny guy. I follow him on Twitter. Very funny on Twitter. And he's got a new book coming out. I'm absolutely going to get my hands on that. If you're a fan of classic rock, a book by Dave Davies should be high on your list to read, and it is on mine for 2022. And lastly, one of the books that was recommended to me during my interviews was Dirty Rocker Boys by Bobby Brown. Carrie Stevens mentioned that one to me when I had her on the show. She and Bobby are friends, and she read Dirty Rocker Boys while she was putting Unrated together. So that's all I got. Hopefully I can make it to everything I talked about today, but I'm sure something will slip through the cracks, and I'm sure I will also add something at some point that I'm not talking about today. So we'll see how all that shakes out at the end of 2022. But with that, all I have to say now is thank you very much for tuning in and watching this video, and thank you so much for tuning in all year if you watched or listened to anything on this channel. 2021 was a great year for this show. I had some amazing guests. I made some podcasts that I'm very proud of, and it means a lot to me that any of you would listen to any amount of it. So thank you very much for another great year. Please stick with us into 2022. I've got so many great plans that I want to do over this next year that I think you're really going to enjoy. So stick with us. There's a lot of great stuff coming down the pipeline. Otherwise, everybody stay safe. Have a happy holiday. Take care of yourselves. And we'll see you in 2022. Good night.